on the screen. Oh, the recording is now on. And basically everyone said like, no, we don't know of any. We can't think of any. We should need to look into this some more. Again, the idea is that surely there must be, but how come nobody can remember anything? There was one exception to this. I did find a reference to a game called Professor Delta, what was supposedly an arcade game. Would have been out in the early 80s. It was a two-player sort of trivia quiz arcade game. It has its own Wikipedia page, but there's no pictures. As far as I know, there's no ROM, no dumps, no hard evidence of the existence of this game at all. Now, you might be thinking, okay, well, maybe there just weren't games in Chile at all. And that's also not quite true either. There was a rich arcade scene. The two big players in the arcade scene in Chile were Diana Entretenimientos, which is basically started a sort of carnival type venue, right? Where you go and, shoot ducks and get all little rides and so on. They're still in operation. They founded in 1934. So Diana had a bunch of locations, arcade locations across Santiago. I'm not sure if they had any outside of Santiago. And Delta is the second big chain. Delta is presumably this Professor Delta game, arcade game, was available at Delta. That's the name. So presumably some Chilean guy, or maybe a employee of Delta, made this game, and they must have had it on some locations. The picture there shows a token. So unlike the United States, where you use quarters and coins, in Chile, all arcade games use tokens. And each venue would have its different tokens with different shapes, so they weren't interchangeable. That actually was a pretty convenient solution in regards to situations when there was a lot of inflation. So you would go and, well, today a token is, let's say, 10 pesos, but tomorrow it could be 11 pesos, right? So you can sort of keep pace with inflation by regulating the price of how expensive it is to play. Similarly, a lot of these places will do special deals where, a token is, say, 10 pesos, but for 100 pesos you get 12 tokens, right? And so on. So arcade scene was existent and lively. I played a lot of these establishments as I was growing up. There's also a relatively strong personal computing scene. Atari computers were perhaps the ones that had the largest presence in terms of sort of market distribution, but you could also get Apple computers, Commodores, IBM PCs, Texas Instruments machines, both the ZX Spectrum and the Time-8 Sinclair. These are basically the same machine, but the American version, the English version, and many more. So personal computing was a thing. In fact, there was a magazine called Microbite. That's the cover of this first issue, thanks to the Internet Archive, from April-May 1984. And in this issue, there's actually an article basically telling people, if you need to buy a computer and you want to buy a computer, here's how to go through the process of figuring out which one to get. There's so many options on the market right now. Here's how to make sense of all the different stats and numbers and so on. So I thought it was kind of interesting that they would dedicate a full article in their first issue to basically that. In the sort of console space, there's also a lot of activity and presence. This is a flyer from, portions of a flyer from a department store called Falabella, advertising the fact that they have the Sega there. Earlier, there was also the Atari 2600 had a presence. That's a picture I got on a Chilean retro game site, basically users posting their collection of. They look like the patches. I asked the person, haven't heard back, if those are, the Atari one there on the left is actually a sticker, a lenticular sticker. So I'm not sure that they distributed the patches like they did in the United States, or if they just had stickers and the stickers look like patches. But in the center, you can see it's a sort of plastic card, sort of an ID membership card indicating that the owner of this card was a member of the Chilean Atari Club. So Atari definitely had a presence too. And so, then NES would not appear in Chile until 1989, at least officially, as a officially distributed product. So when I say that there were no commercial Chilean video games, I think the obvious question that I've been asking is, well, why not? We see a local situation where all the basic ingredients are there. There's access to video games, there's access to technology, this access cuts across all the main, let's say, platforms or market categories at the time. So why no? Why was there no bedroom industry like you saw in Europe particularly the UK and also the US. So an obvious answer to this question is I don't know what I'm talking about, which could be 100% true. But I want to get into sort of why that might be a problem. So let's imagine, for the person in this talk, that I'm not just plain ignorant and wrong. Even though some of you maybe are on the chat going off like, oh, wait a minute, he didn't say, he doesn't know this or X, Y. I'm sure there's like a million games going on in the chat. I don't want to look at it right now. So I thought I'd start with give you a bit of historical context of the Chilean situation in the 70s and the 80s. To do that, I think the easiest place to start is with this guy. So this is Pinochet. Pinochet came to power in Chile in September 11th of 1973 through a military coup, overthrowing the democratically elected government of Salvador Allende. Pinochet remained in power until March 11, 1990, when he gave up the power voluntarily, peacefully, after a plebiscite was conducted, if I remember correctly, in '87. So Pinochet was in power for roughly 17 years, and Pinochet's government was I think an inflection point is probably underselling the stark contrast between the Allende government and the Pinochet government. And so in this context, I want to ask this question, for which I have the answer in the slide right after this, which is, okay, for those people involved in the entertainment, media, and art and creating culture, what happened to these people in the Pinochet government? Okay, what happened to Chile's cultural industries, as it were? And the answer to what happened to many, not all, of course, many artists that were really active in Chile prior to Pinochet's government, is that many of them were either not allowed back into the country. So this happened with a lot of people who were out touring, for example, in Europe, and then basically there's this military coup, and they go, yeah, things don't look so good, so we're not going to go back. Many were forced to flee Chile. Many were also exiled directly by the government. Here's a couple of examples that you might have heard about if you're sort of not Chilean. The person in the middle, that's Isabel Allende, who's gone on to become, a really famous and well-regarded novelist in her own right. So some artists were not allowed back and basically excluded from national life in that sense in Chile, and many others were literally tortured, killed, and disappeared, which is another way of saying killed. Perhaps the most notable example in this case is Victor Jara, who was a singer-songwriter who was famously tortured. His fingers and his hands were broken, and then he sort of forced to play the guitar and so on. So perhaps to this question of why weren't there any commercial Chile games, we might say, well, maybe at this time it was kind of dangerous to be a creator of art and culture, especially if you were not aligned with the politics and policies of the government. So like, well, I'm not going to like put my neck out and make some video games because who knows, I may get exiled and so on and so forth. So in the context of a significant portion of the people who were involved in creating culture, music, movies, writing novels, all the rest of that, you might say, okay, well, what happened to that actual production? Maybe other people took up that mantle. And the answer is, well, not really. Artistic and cultural production in Chile really sort of fell off a cliff. If you compare the numbers and the rhythm and the fervor of the activity pre-Pinochet and post-Pinochet, you basically see that, this is from Wikipedia, noting that film production in Chile was basically pretty low during the military regime. Most people who were making movies were basically being and doing their work in exile. So not only did cultural production take a nosedive, but any cultural production that did continue to exist was also censored and heavily regulated by the government. This is a sort of a little clip from a newspaper noting that I think that the city at the time, like, we're not going to really end up broadcasting it because the government has said, like, no, we're not in line. Okay. So perhaps to this question of why no commercial video games that were sort of Chilean, well, maybe not much of anything was getting made, right? So in this context, it's kind of surprising that maybe we can't find anything or can't hear about anything because so little stuff was getting made even in the first place. So for someone who grew up, I was born in '75, so I was born after the coup. I want to give you sort of perspective. This is my personal perspective on what was Chilean culture, what was Chilean popular culture as I grew up, right? As I'm 5 in 1980 and growing up during the 80s and then into the 90s. So whenever there was like announcements about some sort of Chilean movie or a movie made by Chileans, this was always going to be a movie that was going to be political in some way, even if it was metaphorical. It was a serious movie. It was sort of an artsy movie. Okay, and so as a kid growing up, what that really meant for me, the message that I got, which naivete and youth and ignorance, all that I agree with, was that basically Chilean movies were not for fun and entertainment. Like if I wanted fun and entertainment, if I wanted to be like excited and dream big and so on, I had to watch foreign movies, and that often meant Hollywood, but not necessarily. Now let's go to another sort of entertainment property as well that I would have been interested in as a young kid. So Chilean comics that I grew up with. This is mostly during the 80s. These are comics that were raw. They were sort of underground. They were comics with an X, right? These were alternative, artsy, like different, which again, naivete, ignorance, youth, whatever you call it, basically meant that my perception of Chilean comics that they were not for fun and entertainment. They had messages, and they were messages that I was not necessarily interested or excited. If I wanted to read like the fun comics were basically foreign. These are usually the ones available in Chile at the time were translations that we'd get either from Argentina, also from Mexico as well. Right? So yes, you could read sort of Batman, but it was sort of the Mexican, for Batman it was mostly Mexican translation. There are some exceptions. Condorito is a comic book character from Chile, spread through the rest of Latin America. Definitely Condorito was for fun and entertainment, but it was sort of the exception, right? And so if you think like the situation for comics and movies, the kind of media that I was avidly interested in as a kid, and you bring in video games, it was obvious to me that foreign games were for fun and entertainment, because all the games I was seeing were foreign and they were for fun and entertainment. And so if I work my way backwards from where I was in the others, I sort of meant that, well, I guess that would imply that Chilean games were not for fun and entertainment. And I think there's some truth to this in the sense, I think the answer to my question of why no commercial Chilean video games, I think I would not be surprised if most of the games that we end up finding or discovering over the coming years are edutainment games, educational games, software designed to help kids learn and so on. So not for fun and entertainment, rather for me. And we can ask ourselves, go backwards to, if there were Chilean video games, commercial video games that I could have grown up with, what would they have been like? And sort of by analogy to the other media, perhaps they would have had to have been political in some sense, or serious, or underground, or games with a Z, perhaps, because comics with an X. And so perhaps there were no commercial Chilean video games because maybe there was some sense of perhaps lack of imagination, I want to say, perhaps, where it was really hard to imagine what they could have been like, right? What these, if I wanted to make a video game, what would have been in conversation with, what would have been contrasting to, what would have been pushing up against, and so on. And I think it's hard to imagine yourself as being in a place, in a situation where there isn't, let's say, hope or imagination of what things could be, okay? And I think this might have been particularly the case for Chile because of this situation, right? And here I want to highlight, so if you look on the early years here, Odyssey comes out September 72 in the US, Atari 2600 in 77. So this is basically kind of roughly aligning with the early years of the Pinochet years, right? On the other end, if you look at the 1990s, Sega Genesis comes out in 89, the Super Nintendo system in 1990. So for the Chilean context specifically, I think the timeline kind of lines up, kind of matches up, where in a sense, video games came into existence in the sort of the youthful imaginary, as it were, during the Pinochet regime, right? So video games did not exist prior to Pinochet. I did not exist prior to Pinochet myself personally, right? And so what this means is that we go back to this question of why no commercial Chilean video games. As I said before, maybe dangerous to be a creative art and culture, maybe not much of anything was getting made. But the third point is also perhaps interesting. There's a lack of culture, local cultural references and reference. If you're sort of growing up and making things, who are you talking to? Who are the old timers that you might be in conversation with? Who are the old timers that you may be pushing against or trying to riff off of, and so on? Maybe video games are just too new. This older generation wasn't around, right? Because they were sort of in exile or had gone underground or were doing other things now. So where do you start from, right? Now, of course, there could be lots of other reasons as well, but I think I think point number 3, which is, I'm going to put it out there as a hypothesis that is sort of weakly supported at best, I think could be interesting to explore further, to sort of look at the sort of national context of Chile and look at this problem through that lens. Okay. Now I want to hop on to slightly change the topic here, and bear with me. This will hopefully all come back to you at the end, which is I'm going to give you a sense of what the local video game play culture was like in Chile. And I think what I'm going to talk about now won't be of any surprise to most of you in some sense, but I think it's still important to remind yourselves of that. So this is a picture. This is my fourth grade class in 1984. That's me on there on the far right, the back row. I need to look carefully at that picture. That smiling boy with the terrible haircut, because you're staring into the eyes of a hardened copyright criminal at age 9, in case you're curious. So yes, I was a hardened copyright criminal at that time. My tool of choice was the Apple II computer. That's actually a picture of the Apple IIc computer that I had as a kid. Earlier to this, I had as family an Apple IIe, which that's where in 1984 I had an Apple IIe. It was a couple of years later that I got the IIc, became my own. And what were my wares? What was my product? My product was basically this. So games was basically entirely what I was trafficking in at the time. I had a lot of games. These are just, last time I went to Chile, I took pictures of, I found the little box with a bunch of my floppies, not all of them. So I took pictures, and you can see there's a whole bunch of games. Those with eagle eyes will notice that of all the discs I'm showing, there's only one there, which is an original, legitimate game. So I'm not bringing this up to sort of show off, but I want you to, in today's context, nowadays context, for those of you who are younger especially, I want you to imagine a world where games just appear out of nowhere. Someone someday just shows up and say, hey, I got a new game. And then this game is freely traded, right? So imagine a world where, and these are AAA titles, all the titles, they're just sort of circulating in space easily and freely. I would wander around in fourth grade. I had a printout, a list of all the games that I had. And so I would meet up with friends and I'd ask them, hey, what do you have? I would say, what do I have? And we'd basically trade, right? So it'd be like, okay, I'll get you a copy of this and you give me a copy of that. And I go home, I make the copy, come back next day and make the trade. For my birthday, I used to ask for a box of floppies, basically. I didn't have a lot of money. And so that was like my birthday, like my Santa wish list would have like a box of floppies, which is important there. So a lot of games were basically circulating sort of very freely in a sense. Yes, you could also go to the stores and buy games. These are Atari 2600, sorry, not Atari 800 cassettes. These cassettes have software for Atari 800 on them, games as well, that you could also buy at sort of local stores. There's one on the top left there. That's a sort of the closest thing to I did this by myself, but I put a stamp on it. It indicates like where this game was bought, Poltergeist. Prisma was a local company that was distributed and sell games. That's Pit Stop. Some had, more packaging. That's Tablet right there. I'm sure Nick will appreciate that one. There was a sort of lively scene, but even in the context of you're going to a store to buy a game, you're basically buying a game that someone else has copied onto a cassette tape. So you're not paying for the software, you're sort of paying a markup on the cassette in many ways, right? All the titles were usually worth the same. It doesn't matter what the game was. This was like, it's so much more than a cassette. This is a flyer from an Atari computer club in Santiago. And I just want to highlight the point there. It says, among the services they offer as a club is they also offer access to their library of sort of public use, biblioteca y programoteca, so like our software library. So coming in and we have a bunch of games, a bunch of software, utility programs, and so on, and that's sort of this environment. And so I want to ask you, like, what kind of video game play culture do you get when you're in the context where games can circulate really freely and easily? Now, the way games circulated was kind of unusual, especially if you grew up in the US. So I'm going to show you, like, this is my copy of Ultima 4. This is one of my favorite games, even as I was growing up. And so for this game, what I had were these 2 floppy disks with information on both sides. What I did not have the box for the game, obviously. I did not have the original discs, and that sort of goes without saying, piracy. But I also did not have the reference card for the game. I do not have the history of Britannia as told by Carl the Younger, which is a sort of a guidebook. This is a 40-odd page booklet that had all this information on the backstory of the world and explained how to play the game, what character classes were, and this sort of like cool narrative sense. I also did not have the spell book for the game. In Ultima 4, you could cast spells, but in order to cast spells, you had to figure out basically spells had reagents or requirements. And so the spell basically is like, in order to cast a sleep spell, you're going to need 2 of this and 1 of these. And like, I did not know any of that stuff, right? I had to figure out, first of all, that you could learn that you could cast spells, and then figure out like, how do you actually cast spells? And I'm finding these items, and I didn't know how to combine them and what numbers and quantities and so on. Oh, I also didn't have the cloth map, which is much coveted by collectors nowadays. But yeah, and it gives you a sense of what is the world where this game takes place in. And this world map also has locations named on it, and I did not know. I didn't know these other places you go to and so on. Oh, the box also came with a little metal tank, which for gameplay purposes is absolutely useless. So my point here isn't, I'm not trying to say like, oh, you should be sad for me because I did not have all the stuff that you're supposed to get when you pay the actual price of the game. Because my point here is that all these things that I did not have were information or contained information that was really necessary to understand, make sense of, and be able to play the game, right? And especially for today's context, right, if things have changed a lot, right? Back then, this information was actually really important. Like you learned how to play games from the rule books, from the manuals, and so on. Games didn't have tutorials like they do nowadays. Nowadays, the rule book is like, you don't get a rule book, right? You don't get a booklet, basically, right? And this is also considering the fact that I'm fluent in English. I was at the time as well. And so I wasn't dealing with the language barriers that many of my friends had to deal with, okay? We heard about some of this yesterday in colleagues in Brazil, and how the local Brazilian scene was sort of trying to adapt and figure out like, okay, how do we help players make sense of games? Because the basic idea here is that we were in a vacuum, right? There's no magazines, there's no hotline, there's no YouTube to go to, there's no internet, there's no publisher that has like strategy guides, there's none of that. You're basically getting a floppy and then like, you're on your own, good luck figuring it out. Here's another game that I had. I want to just draw attention to the top line on the list. That's a game called Qubit. Qubit on the Apple looked something like this. I had a green screen, so I didn't even see the colors. I had no idea when I was playing Qubit that Qubit was a knockoff of this other game called Qbert. I literally had no idea that these two things were existing and connected. In fact, for many years, I was convinced that Qbert was a knockoff, that Qubit was the original. And I thought that Edmund Pirelli there was getting screwed over by this other company. Here's another, actually this is the same floppy disk, just the other side. Title on top there is Mario Bros. Right? I first played it on the computer. And I'm going to draw attention there. It says Atari South Presents, and then Cracked by Kilroy was here. That screenshot is actually from the video. It might not actually be the same version that I played, to be honest, but that information, I'll get back to it. So when I played Mario Bros, I had no idea, first of all, that Mario Bros was originally an arcade game, and that I was basically playing a port of an arcade game on a personal computer. I also had no idea that Mario Bros was a sort of spin-off of Donkey Kong in some sense. And also, I did not know later on that Super Mario Bros. Was sort of the sequel to Mario Bros. I knew they were connected because Mario Bros. Like that, just those two words together sort of kind of give a lot of information away. But the connections between these games and the fact that there was the same people working on them and that some of the mechanics in one made their way into another, all that was lost to me. Okay. And so, as I said, we were in the context of understanding video games in an information vacuum. Right? There was no one really to talk to who could like either set you straight or explain things to you and so on. And in this context where understanding video games, like where you're sort of this informational vacuum, what it means is that the clone is the original, right? For your personal, as a player's perception of this game, you have no idea that this even is a clone, right? Nowadays, you look at like, oh man, that is so obviously a clone, or are they knocking this off or knocking that off? Like back then it was like, no, this was the thing. Which means that these influences and connections that exist between games as they're coming out, as new creators are making new games and respond to them, all those connections are lost, or they're misunderstood, or they are created incorrectly, right? Where people become convinced that this game came first than that one, and this game, like this, the knockoff, the clone is original, and the original is a knockoff of the clone. Okay. A lot of the information is also obfuscated through this. In the world of piracy, a lot of information becomes obfuscated. You just get a floppy disk. You might not necessarily know who the developers were, who the publisher was. That information might get confused with the cracking group, for example, or the local distributor, right? If there's a separate group. By local distributor, I mean you bought this game at the store, they put their own sticker, or they change the loader, so the loader says, you know, this company, this company made Pit Stop. You don't know that Pit Stop is a game made by Atari necessarily, things like that. It is often also the case that the changes that might have been made to the software, either by the cracking group or so on, you don't recognize them as changes, right? You just see them as the thing that it is. This can include like copyright dates or the provenance, like where did this game come from, or the fact that there were, they swapped out some tiles for some sprites for different sprites. Okay, And so this kind of shapes the video game play culture in ways that I don't really fully understand, but I'm throwing this out there as a question, right? What does it mean when games circulate freely and easily, but they're stripped of their context? We're learning how to play them as a challenge. It's a different play culture, like where you're always struggling against what key does what in what game and kind of discovering that. When games are in a foreign language as well, and this could be English, could be French, could be Japanese, and so on. And when the information about them is also obfuscated, sometimes by the distribution groups, the cracking groups, and also thus unreliable. So if we take this historical context and local play culture together, does this answer why there are no commercial Chilean games pre-1990? I don't know. Maybe a little bit. It's possible. We'll see. So maybe you've read Gaming the Iron Curtain by Jaroslav Svalch, and I saw this. He has a wonderful website for his book, and I got this text from the website from the book, and it's going to read part of it. So it's Gaming the Iron Curtain offers the first book-length social history of gaming and game design in 1980s Czechoslovakia or anywhere in the Soviet bloc, with bold claims. We'll get into why. It describes how Czechoslovak hobbies imported their computers. Okay, cool. Like, oh, this sounds kind of like Chile. This is going on in Chile too. Built do-it-yourself peripherals. Yep, this is also going on in Chile. Discover games as a medium. Yeah, I'm on board. Using them not only for entertainment. Yes, we're using for entertainment, but also as a means of self-expression. And this is where I go, oh, I didn't know about any of this going on in Chile. I haven't seen any of that going in Chile. Okay, so let's compare Czechoslovakia and Chile. Here are the similarities, or the big picture similarities: the local language, not English, non-democratic state, artistic culture production censored and suppressed. Yep, on the same page here. There's increased civil unrest and resistance, especially through the 1980s, both in Chile and Czechoslovakia. In Czechoslovakia, religion was really restricted and controlled, and the economy was also stagnant command. So there's a command economy that was also stagnant at the time. This is different from Chile, where religion was not restricted or controlled, and there was a free market economy. So clearly that explains the difference, but it seems to go in the wrong direction, right? Because in a free market economy, you would imagine that computers and consoles were more easily available, even if they were so expensive. So I want to hop into looking at sort of the economy and government policies. We saw yesterday, especially in Brazil, the context of Brazil infiltration, how a bunch of legislation in Brazil really shaped what became and what is still to this day like the basic features of the Brazilian games industry and fan culture and production and so on. So in Chile's situation was free market capitalism. A lot of state companies were being privatized. There was inflation that was being like really aggressively trying to stabilize. Pinochet government was really interested in eliminating trade barriers as part of the free market capitalism, so import tariffs were reduced. The Chilean peso had a fixed exchange rate from 1979 to 1982. By 1982, they realized like, oh, this is not working, and so they let that go. And then the peso depreciated significantly, really quickly, and I would say violently in 1982. This led to a major economic recession from 82 to 83. In the years before the depreciation of the peso, this meant it was super cheap to import goods, especially like right before the depreciation. People were flying to Miami to buy like refrigerators and washing machines because it was just cheaper to buy them in the US than in Chile because like the peso was so strong. As soon as the peso depreciated, a lot of people actually went out of business because they'd taken out loans in dollars that all of a sudden were worth like they were now 10 times more in debt than they thought they were. So it became super expensive to import goods from 82 onwards. Obviously, this got better over the years, but in the period right after was basically terrible. If you compare Brazil and Chile here, Brazilian policies were designed to stimulate local industrial production. This is the opposite of what was trying the attempt in Chile. So same kind of policies, but Chile's policies were designed to stimulate exports, right? We're going to lower tariffs, let go of the peso. So peso is worth less, which means you want to sell your stuff abroad, so you get dollars coming in, which are worth a lot, right, or a lot more. Chile didn't have a lot of local industry. This basically meant that if the incentive was to export stuff, you're going to export stuff like quickly without producing it. So Chile exports a lot of copper, lumber, fruit, salmon. All of these things are basically sort of commodities or air quotes like raw materials, as it were, right? Which is very different from exporting refrigerators and TV sets and so on. I got this from Wikipedia. I'll just show you in the gray area, 1980, that's the peak. There's a peak there. So the 82 is when everything is basically tanks, and then it sort of climbs back up there. So you see a trajectory from 75 to 8 to 82 is basically like, hey, things are getting better, and then whoa, and then hey, things are going better again. But the hey, things are going better again at the end of 1990 is basically sort of the peak of 80s as well. Okay. also want to show this. So Chile is not the same as Brazil, not the same as Argentina, not the same as Mexico. This is the GDP per capita in 1980. The bars on the left-hand side, and 1990 the bars on the right. And it shows you that if you look at Chile in both of the bars, like I said, like being 1980 and 1990, it's sort of the same. Like it wasn't everything was flat, as you saw, it basically went down and then it climbed back up again. But basically, Chile's GDP was kind of roughly the same. Look at Brazil, pretty low in 1980, but then goes up, almost doubles by 1990. Argentina, which is the third bar, going from starting from the left. Again, we see a GDP that's better and stronger than, let's say, Chile, and has gotten much stronger by the 1990s. And Brazil kind of is also, I guess, remain kind of the same. Now, what I want to highlight here is that in GDP-wise, Chile was the poorer country of the four leads. Okay, even if Brazil GDP was much lower in the 1980s, there's sort of a lot of growth there happening throughout the 80s and the 90s. Okay, so that's one thing to keep in mind. Chile is a poorer country on a GDP per capita base. Second one is, let's look at the population. So Chile's population, to sort of summarize this whole chart, is Chile's population is really small compared to its neighbors. Its closest neighbor would be Argentina in terms of population, but Argentina's population is twice that of Chile. Mexico and Brazil are basically the sort of the gorillas in the room, as it were. And so when we think about comparing situations across Latin America, it gets really tricky. Yes, there might be a shared language, Brazil being an outlier here in some sense, but the Portuguese and Spanish are pretty similar together. There might be common culture in many ways. If you watch Chespirito or Chapulín Colorado, like these were things that like kids all across Latin America, I think, grew up with, especially at my age. Condorito is also similar, like appears in all kinds of countries. There might have been similar political climate. People talk about military dictatorships in Latin America, that's the 70s and 80s, Argentina, Brazil, Chile, also as well. Perhaps we're all similar because we're all, of course, third world countries as well. But there are differences in economic policies. There are different international connections. I think I'd like to learn more about this connection between Brazil and Japan. I know there's a lot of Japanese, there's a fair amount of Japanese immigration to Brazil. I sort of wonder if perhaps that has shaped these relationships as well in some sense. So even within the third world, the status, size, and scale difference can really be significant, right? In that sense, Chile, I'm not saying Chile is an outlier to Latin America, but Chile is very different from these other countries, or these bigger countries that we hear about. It's possible even that Chile was closer to Czechoslovakia than Argentina or Brazil across this, right? So my whole point is, I'm trying to say is that Chile was much smaller than these other countries, right? And what this means, if you take a smaller country and we're looking at a small industry in a small country, is that sometimes singular events or people can have an outsized effect in terms of these narrativations that we might still nowadays, if we go back and look at these events, right? We were hearing yesterday about the telematch, right, in Argentina. And you think of the history of that whole product is basically some guys who owned a company, as far as I know, if I understood it correctly, travel to the US and go like, oh, this is a cool thing, and they bring it back. And they're able to do stuff with it, not because they are probably smart and savvy and all that stuff, but also because they own this giant company that's already doing stuff like that, or they're working for a company that's already doing things like that, right? So it's sort of like this one lucky event, this person going and being inspired by this product that's not bringing it back, gives birth to a local industry of some sense, right? There's a danger in imagining that the story is true or is the catalyst. But that's, I don't mean that the facts of that story are not true. I just mean the story we tell of that, right? It also means the context of Chile, for its own microhistory and development, that these networks of privilege are much smaller too. And here's what I mean by privilege. If you take the United States, in 1984, according to the census, 8.2 households had a computer at home. By 1989, that number is up to 15%. According to Jaroslav Svalch in his book, 1.8% of households had a computer at home in Czechoslovakia in 1989. I have no idea what the number was for Chile in 1989. I tried to look it up and found. Now we know the United States that even in the 80s, computers were expensive and not everyone could afford one, right? So having a computer is already like a sign of a certain amount of privilege, right? If you take that and I think, well, in the context of Czechoslovakia and Chile, much poorer countries, computers were comparatively more expensive even in the US. And that means that presumably, I would guess that the Chilean percentage, let's say it was 5%, let's say it was 8%. That's a smaller percentage, but also for lower numbers. It's a much smaller number, right? And so when we look at these industries, you have to say, well, who had access to these things? Who was in a position to be able to make things and do things? These numbers are just like much more reduced, right? I mean, yesterday we were hearing about the telematch, right? This is from Phil's talk yesterday, and he had the slide, right? This list, the slide on the left, sorry, on the right hand side has this list of all the consoles, like homegrown or local consoles, clones, what do you want to call them, from Latin America. And when he had the slide, I was like, oh look, it was all Brazil and all Argentina basically. I think there was one Colombian, one from America. There's nothing in Chile, and I'm not saying that there aren't any in Chile. Maybe there are. We'll find out, I guess, maybe. But what I'm trying to say is that the size and the characteristics of the local industry and economy, they give significant importance to something like the telematch case to occur, right? Not a guarantee. I'm not trying to be sort of deterministic in that sense. But I'm basically saying is that Argentina has an industry and a population and wealth that is larger, thus more likely that some companies would see this as an opportunity that they could capitalize on for their local economy. And because the Chilean economy is it's too small, not rich enough, not enough people, that maybe someone tried to do something and was like the crazy entrepreneur and it's failed because there just weren't enough people to buy it. Okay. Similarly, also in this case of Chile, for example, I had an Apple, right? So I was connected to people that also had Apples. There were people that had Spectrums and they had their own connections. The people that had Commodores, they had their own connections. There were other people that had Apples, right? Maybe the people that did not speak English like I did and had access to other people who were beginning software from other places, right? The Atari on the computer scene was the biggest in Chile. They had their own connections and so on. The Atari 2600, and maybe some of these were connected, so maybe the Atari 2600 people also had Atari computers, but these are all very small networks, and these are also small networks that are basically disconnected from each other, right? There's very little reason to talk across these sort of boundaries between them. Lots of networks, very fragmented, loosely interconnected. Some of the networks here might be wealthy, so some of these might cut across class, social class, wealth, income, and so on, and others not so much, right? I mean, I just want to show this slide again. This is from Phil's talk. He says, look, he's talking about the Gradiente, this console comes out in Brazil. What surprised me the most about this console was that it came out in 1988, right? So by 1988, if you're following the mainstream in the US and Europe and so on, this console is wildly obsolete, right? It is not cutting edge by any stretch of imagination, right? And what does this mean in the context? It means that, for example, I had an Apple, right? I had an Apple computer that had a floppy disk. And the floppy disk was already like in a different category from people that had computers with a cassette tape, right? And so in some sense, that's why these networks are also very disconnected from each other, right? There's like, what am I going to talk about with this guy who has an Atari 100 because his games are on cassette tape, and so it takes 20 minutes to load a game. I'm like, oh, I don't know what you're talking about. I have a floppy. It's super easy. I copy. There's other kinds of conversations, but this also means that a lot of the local production work was oriented towards some of these networks and not others, right? There's this fabulous video, a documentary, it's about an hour long, clip on with that, which looks at a Chilean company called Turbosoft, and they made a lot of products for Atari computers. And basically, the story of this company is we're making products that are basically extending the viability of this early computer. So that's the Atari Injector, which is basically a mod of the Atari tape drive. And the mod is like they actually opened it up and sold it in some new parts that basically allow them to record cassette tapes with game information at higher frequencies so that you could basically transmit information faster to your computer. You also have to mod the computer on the other end so they could like listen to these higher frequencies. And so you could basically you could load games in 8 times faster, 4 times faster, twice as fast. I think this was their last product. It's a video cartridge that has 300 games. And it's basically, they figured out how to encode games onto a VHS tape that they would then plug into a cart that would then plug into the computer. So basically, instead of loading from a tape, you can now load from a VHS tape instead. And VHS has basically more information, and so you can load things again much faster, right? And now these products are basically super innovative, but also super obsolete. Right? This is like at this point, other people had moved on to floppies and so on. So they're basically keeping the cassette people, the people interested in cassette computers alive. So those questions are like, Jose, is this wrong? There were no commercial video games. Maybe there were. Maybe there were networks that I was not connected to. Maybe they were at a scale that was so small that you couldn't really notice it outside of the networks. And maybe they weren't notable because of being obsolete. I'm using these in air quotes here for sure, right? So I feel bad if I just leave you with like no stories of any Chilean games. So I did want to give you a bit of a code everywhere. I'm wrapping up here. So 1990s and after, right? So Pinochet steps down in 1990. We have a new president, Richard Owen, and now we're back to democracy. And if you follow like the economic trends, basically this is when our economy like really shot off, right? So I want to highlight one particular company here. Is 1984. This company is called Unlimited. Unlimited, basically, as far as I can tell, was the first Chilean company to produce interactive CD-ROMs for the international market. So Chile is so small. Basically, everyone says, yeah, you know what? If we're going to make a living out of this, we have to think about always selling stuff abroad, nothing for the local market. Now, they did have a lot of products in local market as well. They had a special deal with newspapers that would distribute a lot of their CD-ROMs. Maybe you played or heard of Hamsterland. I think this is one of the biggest hits. Kinder Kids. They had a whole bunch of things. Everything they made was basically educational in some way or another. That was 1994. 1999, at the computer science department at the School of Engineering at the Catholic University in Chile. This guy, that's me in 2001. You can tell there's a Tomb Raider movie poster behind me. So at this department, it's a new class that's announced. This is a design and implementation of video games, which is a new course announced for the first semester of the year 2000. I taught that class. I taught it actually with a colleague of mine. I was hired as an instructor. I was like, I guess a sort of assistant professor as soon as I graduated. And so I was the one officially on the books for teaching this class, but in practice, we co-taught it with Jorge Villalon, who's now the director of digital transformation at the Universidad of Firenze. So we taught this video game class in 2000, 2001, 2002. We did not teach it in 2002, it was 2000 and 2003, because middle of 2002 is when I came to the US to get my PhD. Students from the three, we taught this, like I said, we taught this class 3 times. Many of our students went on to sort of start up and start working at the first video game companies, big scale, like making actual games companies in Chile. Microbite is one of the earliest big ones. They later became Behavior. Some people left then Behavior and founded Giant Monkey Robot, Ace Team. Maybe you've heard about Ace Team, and also Tiny Byte Games. Microbite started in 2002. Now it's Behavior in Active Chile. There's some of the titles that they're sort of famous for, and they're titles that you would not know were sort of made in Chile. Right? And Ace Team, I think, is the other sort of highlight of the Chilean local industry. Ace Team is basically an indie game. I had 2 of the brothers actually in, like, I think the first year we taught the game class. Andres and Carlos. They started as modders, so they started in 98, 99 as modders, but they only released their first game, Xenoclash, in 2009. They actually spent a couple years, so they were modders and they worked at Wacko Games, and then left Wacko to basically go indie full time. Their most recent game is Eternal Cylinder, which I think is up for some IGF awards this year. So definitely check it out. So the Chilean industry has definitely grown since. It has its own trade organization. It is also supported by the government. If you've been to GDC, there's often a Chile stand at GDC that's supported by Pro Chile. If you're curious about the current state of the Chilean industry, as well as other countries in Latin America, definitely check out this report. There's somebody familiar who worked on it right there. It gives you all information what the current status is. There's a bunch of links to additional sources, some of the pictures and so on that I found. Thank you very much for your time. I appreciate it. And if you definitely know something about Chilean-made pre-1990 commercially distributed video games, please get in touch with me. There's my email. I'm also on Twitter. So thank you very much.
Cool. And, you know, I wanted to point out something you did at the very end there that I've been really happy to see throughout the symposium is this kind of request to extend the ideas. And it's almost an invitation that I think we're starting to realize that networks we're working in and trying to reconstruct some of this history, some of this scholarship, and move it forward. And it's just been really neat to see that. I feel like it's been a while since I've seen the earnest call, right?
Yeah.
So thank you for that very much. And I knew you'd kill this. This is amazing. Thank you so much. Do have a couple questions to come in here, and we have a little bit of time. I'm going to go into the break a little bit. One question was from Sule Ferroso, and it was, have you been able to identify localization initiatives and or creative appropriation of games during dictatorial Chile? And I guess just generally speaking, have you been able to find those organizations or groups?
Yeah, so that's a really great question. I don't have a lot of information. And so here's the additional context. I'm going to hypothesize right now, sort of on the fly. So the computers were being sold illegally and over the counter in not black market sense, right? So there were local distributors that had deals with Atari, for example. they had their own teams that would do some localization and stuff. I think a lot of that localization was on the loaders, kind of front end things, right? So you buy your computer, you get the set tape that said you have a bunch of games. My understanding that a lot of those outfits did do some of their own development, but I'm not sure how much of it was from scratch development versus how much of it was just sort of reskinning kind of situations. Now, the tricky thing with Chile, which you wouldn't get in Brazil, is that I think there's also a lot of sort of imports via other local countries, right? So I would imagine that a lot of the software that was available in Spanish, for example, in Chile, was not necessarily made in Chile, but maybe it was translated or localized in Argentina, and then just like brought over straight, right? So there's a local South American networks are also a part of that. So when I say provenance, it's like, yeah, I got this game and it is in Spanish, and maybe I recognize that it was originally in English, but the Spanish version I'm getting is through Argentina, via Uruguay, via Paraguay, right? And so like, who knows how that is all working out, right? For example, I know for a fact that PlayStation, paired to PlayStation games that were not localized at all, because they're just straight up rips and burns. In Santiago, the high quality ones were the Paraguayan ones. So they were sort of, they weren't necessarily being burned locally. They were being pressed in Paraguayan distribution plants, I guess.
Cool. I wanted to ask a question, and Texas Tech Phil, because we have more than one Phil on the call, and I have been talking a bit about paratextuality and paratext in gaming, and I was particularly drawn to your notes about how does it change the experience of gaming when you only have a handwritten label and a floppy disk. And the comparison I often give my students is I think about in the 80s when, the number of kids who bought Zelda, threw the box away because it was cardboard, started playing it and realized that the map was in the box, it was now in the trash, but they still had all these other artifacts. And we know, I'm sure Adrian will be talking about this later, some of those artifacts matter. We know from nostalgia research, for example, that the paratexts are often the things that trigger nostalgia, sometimes even more so than the game itself. And I was curious, if you had any more insights on how that influences, your relative engagement with those game worlds, for better or for worse. But I'm also curious if there are parallels to other gaming cultures in the world that may have consumed these products in sort of this third-party offshoot way that strip them of sort of the glossy bits, but from talking to you and watching your career, clearly did not diminish your ability to get involved in games, right? So I love this notion. I would be curious to hear more about it.
So I think part of it, this might relate to how people consider games nowadays, and there's like how things have changed and come full circle. So nowadays we do live in an environment where games are, in many sense, sort of freely available, right? The free-to-play games, there's so many games out there, there's so many humble bundles and Steam sales and so on, that we're sort of spoiled for choice. And so the way I think about it is in the 80s, I was spoiled for choice in many ways because I just had so many games. And this is like relative numbers, obviously, right? It wasn't the fact that I had like one new game a year. I have, I could get in a month, I might get like 5-6 new games, right? So in that sense, you're spoiled for choice, which also means that games can become much more disposable. And so there were definitely a lot of games that I just bounced off of because I just never figured out how to play them, right? I almost bounced off of Bard's Tale. Please don't. Bard's Tale is an RPG, and in Bard's Tale you leveled up, right? So you got all the experience, but you didn't actually level up. To level up, you had to go to a special location and train. Like you had to go to the Fighters Guild, and that's where you trained. They actually got the levels. Like you sort of cash out your experience points per levels. It wasn't until like I'm at 20 hours into the game when I realized like, oh, there's a special place in the world where you have to go and do this thing. I've been playing as like a level 1 character and making progress, and this game was like obviously getting increasingly harder, and I was like really struggling. Like this makes no sense. What are all these experience points for, anyways? And then before I realized like, oh, there's this thing to level up. If I had the game with the manual, I would have known, right? And so that entry ramp into the game, it's much easier to just like bounce off of it immediately, right? On the other hand, games are much more magical in that you are discovering things, right? When I discovered that Lode Runner had like a level editor, it just like blew my mind, right? There's like the secret knowledge that is as you discover like what are the commands for the game, like, oh, did you realize if you do Shift K, like this thing happens? So that kind of information also becomes valuable within the smaller communities that we're moving around in. So it goes, I think it cuts both ways, right? It can be good, but also bad.
Right, you get to experience, there's a magic of discovery. I think I think of going to a garage sale and buying a board game that's missing the instructions, or buying, in some ways buying games in that way. And some folks in chat notice the parallels between how we buy digital games, as you noted, that sometimes have very different kinds of paratext that may or may not add to the experience. Thank you for that. I wanted to let Bobby ask a question because we do have a couple of extra minutes. So Bobby, go ahead, please.
So Jose, I'm glad that you talked about the spoil for choice thing, because that was going to be one of my questions, which was, did you feel like there was still a finite resource of games as you're trading them back and forth? But to build on that, then the second part of the question that I was interested in is the idea that, like, you as the person that has a big list of games that you could dupe for anybody, were there like informal networks of like tastemakers, and were there informal ways of saying like, well, if you want to get a game from me, you have to trade a game like back to me. Like there's sort of like a upload download ratio, like on an old wares site. Did those sorts of things exist?
So tastemakers, not that I was aware of, right? And maybe I was just the omnivore. Like, what if you have something that I don't have, I want it. Like that was always my approach. My restriction was, do I have enough floppies to copy stuff onto? And so if I didn't have floppies because I like used them all up, then I was like, oh no, I'm in trouble. So I think the notion of tastemaker was less relevant because it was easy enough to have everything that your networks had access to, right? So currency in that sense. So currency was like when I was trading, it was like, yeah, sure, someone like you wouldn't get it for free, but it was always a trade. Like, hey, what do you have that I don't have? What do I have that you don't have that you want, right? And that's like, okay, I'll trade you this for that. And there was usually like floppies, like number of floppies. So if this game is on 4 floppies, then you get 4 floppies worth of stuff that I would load up, as it were. One of the key currencies was actually, and this I discovered for a while, was copy programs. So if you had access to better copy programs, that was important, in the sense that you were then, like someone said, I have this game, but I can't copy it. It's like, oh, okay, well, I've got you. And then we can like make a better deal because I was actually able to make copies of this game. Pippin copy was my favorite because it was the fastest. But for the really tricky ones, you'd have to use Locksmith. I think, remember Locksmith as like, but yeah, Locksmith was good. Like Locksmith was basically copy anything once you, again, figured out like what the different, like how to configure different settings, which I had no idea what was going on. I'm like 9 years old, right? So this like, I'm just trying stuff out until it works. Pippin copy was great because it was like super fast. The others were like, okay, this is going to be like an afternoon of trying to figure this out. So yeah, copy programs, and then basically, if I don't have it, I want it. I don't care what it is. So it wasn't like, oh, I only like sports games. Like, no, just give me whatever.
Jose, thank you for sharing, in particular, the journey. I think it was neat for many of us to see you stitch this through your own filter in a very authentic way. And I love the posing of the question is, like we really don't know, right? We got to sort it out. And I hope that this presentation for you and for others is opening, again, like I've said yesterday, more questions that it answered, because what we're learning more than anything is there are so many things left to unpack. Maybe it was really appropriate that Phil started us with an unboxing video, because we're doing that now, for 2 days. We're going to transition to the break right now. I know folks will be staying on the call, so feel free to chat. Jose, I think a couple of folks in chat may have some questions for you. We have a slight program change for the next session at 10:15. Phil Chavot and I are going to swap moderator roles. I have to make an airport run, and I'm going to pop back in a little bit. So we'll keep the call moving. We'll give everybody a break. Thank you very much for the talk. That was very fun to listen to.
I appreciate it. Thank you very much. I'll keep my mic open. We can chat some more during the break. I'll be around for sure. Thanks.
Thanks, Jose.
I guess I can stop sharing.
Are you still there? I had a question. So I was wondering how many of your friends that you knew during this time when you were doing all of this work on and with computers, how many of those friends got into that? Because that sounds like really high level, maybe not high level, but mid-level coding skill and computer capability. So I'm wondering, like how many people took that skills that they learned kind of on their own and made a career out of it in your world?
So at the elementary school level. So there's different phases, right? Elementary school, like high school, and then college. College is 90s for me.
Right.